Which Denver Broncos position groups on offense and defense will have the biggest impact for the team ahead of the 2022 regular season? Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we share our predictions, and we want you, Broncos country, to share yours on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch us on YouTube, do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody, Roark, Broncos beat reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre, Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. And, coming off the eve of Russell Wilson's massive contract extension, we're going to approach sometimes, obviously with a holiday coming up on Monday, I think it's super important that we maybe do a little bit of preseason predictions, in a sense, before the regular season, and talk about which positions on offense and defense will have the biggest impact on the success of this team this upcoming season. I can't wait to hear Broncos country's responses. I can't wait to see them in the YouTube comment section. I can't wait to get your insights, Sayre.
I'm excited, Cody. I brought out the old crying Jordan mug, and it wasn't intentional, but I feel like, it can kind of serve as an ironic piece now at this point, because things are well in Broncos country heading into the season. I can't wait to talk more about just kind of our thoughts as before the games get going. We've kind of covered every single layer of this team, but now it's really getting down to the nitty gritty. Now we're finally going to get to see. I was just thinking about this the other day, actually. It's kind of interesting. Like, I saw Jerry Jeudy in the Behind the Broncos thing, and I'm like, dang, I feel like I haven't seen Jerry Jeudy in a long time. It just kind of feels like when we see the Broncos out on the field, it's going to be like seeing old friends or something like that. So it's going to be great. I can't wait. Broncos country, we're ready to ride. So let's start talking about this team. What's going to happen now? Russell Wilson under contract, ownership group in place. Everything is locked in and ready to go.
I like that you said that. Everything is locked in, and we are locked on Broncos here on today's episode of the show. I will say the crying Jordan mug could be like a symbolism for this week, just for Seattle Seahawks fans, because Geno Smith's their starting quarterback. Drew Lock couldn't win the starting job, and their former franchise quarterback just got a massive contract extension with the Denver Broncos. So Seahawks fans, enjoy the crying Jordan mug, courtesy of our good friend Sayre Bedinger. All right, well, let's get into this. Let's start things off here by taking a look at which Denver Broncos offensive position group will have the biggest impact this season. Sayre, I'll start, and I think it's cliche, but you know what? I think it rings true. Quarterback will have the biggest impact for this Broncos offense this upcoming season, and I think it's all because of one guy, and that is Russell Wilson and what he's already done to come into this franchise and help transcend things. I mean, reset the expectations in Denver, and now with a brand new contract extension, which, by the way, if you missed the episode, the Breaking News podcast on the Russell Wilson contract extension, make sure you go back on Locked On Broncos. Make sure you watch or you listen so you get all the information possible on what this means for the Denver Broncos. But usually, Sayre, a superstar quarterback can make up for any deficiencies that you usually have on a football team. But I was even asking a question right now. And we don't know this, and we probably won't know till probably like the first few games of the regular season. Do the Broncos have any deficiencies right now on the offensive side of the ball? And I would say maybe like Broncos fans' biggest question will be on the offensive line, probably. What does the new offensive line look like? What will they look like in the regular season? But I also think that with Russell Wilson, with his ability to scramble, maneuver outside the pocket, step up into the pocket, and manipulate things, I think that, he can make up if there are any kind of struggle performances on the offensive line. But that's something that will obviously continue to be worked out.
It will be, and I think what's important for everyone to remember is that the offensive line is going to look better because of Russell Wilson, in my opinion. You got a lot of receivers that can also get open. I forget who to credit for this statistic. So, Cody, these Broncos receivers, they're not struggling to get open. And with the offensive line, Russell Wilson has kind of a history of holding the ball a little bit longer, but that's because he likes to crank the deep ball, right? He likes to crank the deep ball. So obviously he's going to take deeper drops. Obviously he's going to let those routes develop for a little bit longer. And I think we will see a bit of that in Denver this year. But to me, it's not the offensive line that's going to be the key. We haven't even got to see the starting offensive line for the Broncos, really, outside of you guys at training camp and getting to see them daily. And none of us have seen them in a game setting yet in terms of the starting five. We don't even know, is Billy Turner going to be the starting right tackle? So to me, the next up after quarterback, because I agree with you, that is the position on the offense that's going to have the biggest impact this year. But I think behind that, it's got to be wide receiver, because you got to have guys that will go out there and capitalize. When Russell Wilson puts a ball on you, can you come down in that tight coverage? Can you bring the ball in if he throws it through a tight window in the red zone on a 3rd and 9 or something like that, and he hits you for what would be a touchdown? What we don't want to be talking about after these games, Cody, is we don't want to be talking about, well, Jerry Jeudy dropped a touchdown pass or Russell Wilson threaded the needle, or Cortland Sutton dropped a deep ball in the second quarter that could have turned the tide of the game, or these types of different things. The wide receivers, there's a lot of pressure, in my opinion, on the Broncos wide receivers this year. KJ Hamler coming back from injury. Montreal Washington obviously being thrust into a big role. There's no Tim Patrick anymore this season. That's huge for the Denver Broncos. So to me, the wide receivers have a big pressure to a lot of expectations to live up to, quite frankly. Now that Russell Wilson is in place, he's got the big money deal, and we know that he's going to hold up his end of the bargain. These wide receivers got to hold up their end of the bargain as well.
And I think these two positions will have a big impact. And I think last year, Sarah, just watching the wide receivers, watching the Broncos offense, the wide receivers, they struggled. And it wasn't due to them. It was due to the quarterback, right? So now you have two positions now that are kind of offsetting and elevating each other. I think with Russell Wilson, it automatically amplifies the opportunities that this Denver Broncos football team has with their wide receivers. And I think that's something that is super important, that isn't being touched about enough, because I just remember going back and I made the mistake of going back and watching last year's games again, and there were just so many missed opportunities by Teddy Bridgewater to capitalize with guys like Tim Patrick, Jerry Jeudy, when he came back from an injury. And then Cortland Sutton, obviously. Cortland Sutton, in my opinion, I felt like he was robbed of last year. And I think that now with Russell Wilson under center, Cortland Sutton will elevate once again. And if anything from training camp practices has been a trend, Cortland Sutton will be a major focal point of this offense. But this is the year of Jerry Jeudy. This is the breakout year for Jerry. And I think that he's just super locked in right now. I'm super excited to see what happens with this Denver Broncos offense. And Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. Sarah and I are going to share our thoughts on which Broncos defensive position groups will have the biggest impact on the team this upcoming season. We also want yours as well. Make sure you comment on YouTube. But before we do that, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. It's our good friends over there, BetOnline.net. And BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports information this season. You can find all the latest football league developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts, including this year's opening week games. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Which Broncos defensive players and position groups will have the biggest impact on the team this upcoming season? Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform. Whether you watch us on YouTube, do us a favor. If you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage every single day, all year long. We have you covered. Sarah, continuing on our conversation on today's episode of the show, we're eager for Broncos Country's responses on YouTube and also on social media. If you want to tweet us, you're more than welcome to do just that at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger. But which defensive position group will have the biggest impact for the Broncos this upcoming season? Sayre, who's your pick?
Cody, I got to go with a position group that I feel like has been not living up to expectations over the last few years. And that has a lot of different factors going into it. But I'm going to say the edge position. And first of all, why do I say that they haven't been living up to expectations the last few years? Well, as of 2018, we thought we were getting an era of Bradley Chubb and Von Miller. And unfortunately, injuries robbed us of that. And other guys had to step up in their absence, guys that aren't with the team anymore, quite frankly. I mean, Malik Reed was just traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Remember last year, we were talking about this off the air the other day, Cody, but Anthony Chickillo was in that rotation last season. I just think that, man, it's time for the edge position to be kind of rejuvenated, revived in Denver again. Remember that championship season back in 2015? It was waves of pass rush. It was Von Miller, DeMarcus Ware, Shane Ray, Shaquille Barrett. I mean, you had all these guys out there contributing and playing huge roles. And the same, I mean, it kind of feels the same this year. I know that Bradley Chubb and Randy Gregory are not Von Miller and DeMarcus Ware from 2015, but I think those two guys can be very, very good. And Baron Browning, Nick Bonito, Jonathan Cooper, Aaron Patrick. To me, you keep 6 edge players on your roster. You're obviously banking on this group being one of the most impactful on the entire roster. If you're saying, hey, out of 53 guys, we got 6 of them coming off the edge. That shows just how important this position group is to George Payton. It shows how important it is to defensive coordinator Ejiro Evero and this whole coaching staff. To me, Cody, the edge position group is the most important factor for this team this year, because the Broncos have to be able to bring pressure off the edge in order for everybody else on this defense to capitalize.
I'm glad that you mentioned that too, right? Because yes, I think it's very illustrious that, you know, the guys like Bradley Chubb and Randy Gregory are not DeMarcus Ware and Von Miller from 2015. However, I believe at their best version, if the Broncos get the best version of Bradley Chubb and Randy Gregory, and they have the sprinkle and impact of what we've already seen from Baron Browning all throughout the preseason, my goodness, he's been fun to watch. The other guys mixing in, Nathaniel Hackett wants to send pass rush in waves. I believe the Broncos defense can be very, very good this upcoming season, but I'm going to go with the position group that benefits the most if the edge rushers have the success that we want them to see, and that is the secondary. We're talking about the cornerbacks. We're talking about the safeties, and kind of reminiscent of that 2015 Denver Broncos season. What was the theme? The pass rush was so good for the Broncos. The secondary was just locking opposing wide receivers up. They were getting interceptions. They were taking the ball away, and I think if the Broncos pressure can get to opposing quarterbacks and force them to kind of throw off their quarterback clock a little bit, more interceptions, more takeaways will be up for grabs for Denver, which is something that they need. I mean, when Patrick Surtain and Justin Simmons are your only 2 players that are leading the team in takeaways, that have the most production of all your takeaways, that right there is a concerning thing, because you want it to be spread out a little bit more. You want more takeaways and more volume amongst players. I think with Ronald Darby, the big question this year will be whether or not teams look to test Patrick Surtain. And he even, met with the media a few days ago and was even talking about just maybe playing into like learning how to bait quarterbacks a little bit. He's been doing that in training camp practices so far for the Broncos this offseason. But for him, he also says, that's the ultimate compliment. It means that, they respect my game. He said my stats will take a little bit of a hit there, but it's the ultimate sign of respect if they don't look to test me as often as they did last year. He saw 97 targets as a rookie and was very, very efficient. But I think, Ronald Darby, if he can stay healthy, we'll see a lot of targets, gets more opportunities for interceptions. K'Wan Williams inside the nickel, I think if he can stay healthy, can be a game changer for the Broncos against the run, and also an underrated element in the passing attack. And then guess what? We get to the safety position where you have Justin Simmons, who's had back-to-back 5 interception years for him. I think that speaks volumes there, in Kareem Jackson, the veteran presence. But you're going to be mixing in guys like P.J. Locke and Caden Stearns. Denver has a lot of versatility here in the secondary, and I believe that this unit will have the biggest impact for the defense this season, but I do agree. It's like a marriage in unison. They will have success as long as the edge rushers that you chose to have the biggest impact for the team this year has success, and I think that right there needs to be highlighted. It needs to be touched on. That is one of the most important elements of this Broncos team here in 2022. Well, Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. We're getting into some Broncos news and notes ahead of the weekend, including the Broncos adding a former CU player to their practice squad, not to mention some more details on the Russell Wilson contract extension, some new details that give a little bit more insight as to how it helps the Broncos and how it helps the optics, I think, from the player side of things. You get to that coming up here in just a moment. But real quick, just want to say thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day. We have a Locked On podcast for you. So if you're a Broncos fan, Locked On Broncos needs to be your daily go-to. If you're a Nuggets fan, Locked On Nuggets needs to be your daily go-to for all the pick and roll action surrounding your Denver Nuggets. Not to mention, Colorado Avalanche season is starting up very soon alongside the Denver Nuggets. Check out the Locked On Avalanche podcast as they look to defend the Stanley Cup this upcoming season. We also have the Locked On Rockies podcast as well. You're a Colorado sports fan. The Locked On Podcast Network is where you need to be. It was surprising enough just a few days ago when the Broncos set their practice squad at only 13 players on a 16-player practice squad spot. But the Broncos, sprinkling in some moves throughout the next couple of days here to fulfill that 16-man roster spot here. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much. Sayre, the Broncos added some more offensive line help to their practice squad, signing Will Sherman to the practice squad. He's a former New England Patriot. He was drafted by them in the 6th round in 2021, and he spent last year on the Patriots practice squad. But, anytime there's that former CU tie, it's always great. But in your opinion, can the Broncos make anything out of this move? And then we'll also touch on maybe the final 2 practice squad spots that are up for grabs.
Yeah, I kind of like this, Cody, honestly, just going out and getting a guy that was drafted in the 6th round last year. You obviously said goodbye to 2021 6th round pick Seth Williams. I guess not officially. I haven't seen where he's signing anywhere just yet, but certainly if the Broncos are saying goodbye to their own 2021 6th round pick, it kind of makes sense. You bring in somebody else's, right? You kind of replace him. So Will Sherman, obviously coming in he's a former Colorado player. I think he's going to probably play interior line for the Broncos, Cody, and he graded out pretty highly for the Patriots in the preseason. According to Pro Football Focus, I believe he was their 7th highest graded player over the course of the entire preseason. So really strong preseason from him. I'm sure the Patriots wanted to bring him back onto the practice squad again, but he obviously sees a better path to potential playing time in the future in Denver, maybe a better scheme fit. Who knows what he's thinking there in terms of just it's his decision to go where he wants at this point. So he's chosen the Denver Broncos. He fills spot number 14 out of 16 on the practice squad as of right now. And like you mentioned, that still leaves 2 spots available. We kind of speculated when the Broncos finalized their practice squad, quote unquote, finalized at 13 players, that maybe they were looking at outside guys to bring them in and kind of just working out those details. Obviously, now we see some fruit of that. We see that they're bringing in an offensive lineman. I still think, Cody, they need another corner. I think they need another receiver. They only got 2 spots left, so we'll kind of find out what they're thinking here. But for now, we got another offensive lineman in the fold.
Is that final wide receiver spot on one of the 2 spots on the practice squad, is that being saved right now for Brandon Johnson? I know the team is working on an injury settlement for him, which will allow him to play the season because he was kind of placed on the injured reserve facet, and I think a lot of people are confused. Oh, this means his season is over. I mean, with the high ankle sprain, it's going to take some time, but I think if you get the injury settlement, now he can come in, he can re-sign to the practice squad, and now you can have him. So I think one of those final spots is being saved for him, and then potentially, as you mentioned, a cornerback. So we'll see if the Broncos look to address that position, add any more depth there. As is, we know on the practice squad, as is, Faion Hicks and Jaquan McMillan make up the defensive backs that are at that position on the practice squad. That also adds to Patrick Surtain, Ronald Darby, K'Wan Williams, Asang Bassi, Damari Mathis. Those are the guys that kind of stand out when we look at it at the end of the day. I think for Denver, it's going to be very interesting to see how they maneuver. And then not to mention, too, we talk about the short-term injury reserve moves with Greg Dulcich. We talk about that also with Michael Ojemudia and Tom Compton. When those guys are ready to return, the Broncos will have to release 3 players that are on their 53-man roster to make way for them. So that, to me, I think will be very interesting. Who do the Broncos elevate? I mean, who will they release at this point? Because right now, the 53-man roster is pretty strong, I think, when we look at it from top to bottom. So some tough decisions will have to be made, at least going into that Week 5 matchup against the Indianapolis Colts on Thursday night football. So a short week from Week 4 against the Raiders to the Indianapolis Colts. That'll be a little bit of a tough stretch for this Denver Broncos team. But now let's transition to some other details that have emerged, according to our good friend Andrew Brandt, on Russell Wilson's contract details. Now, it says here there's a $50 million signing bonus plus other bonuses, which equal $57 million in 2022. This also makes him the second highest paid player in the NFL. In 2022, Matthew Stafford takes the cake at a whopping $61.5 million. Man, I mean, who would you rather have, Matthew Stafford, Russell Wilson, when we talk about just player ability? I think everyone's going to say, oh, you know what, Matthew Stafford's got his ring. Well, right now you look at Russell and you look at Matthew, they're 1-1 in Super Bowls. So, yeah, who would you take in this situation? What are some of the other details that have emerged about Russ's contract?
I'm riding with Russ. You know, all due respect to Matthew Stafford, I think it's great, though, to see, because Stafford, I think the narrative on him coming out of Detroit was that, well, even though, you know, it's the Lions and all those things, like he'll never be good enough to win a Super Bowl, even outside of Detroit, but he proved that wrong in short order. So hopefully Russell Wilson can continue this trend that's going in the NFL. You know, Tom Brady with a new team in 2020, winning a Super Bowl. Matthew Stafford last year with a new team, winning a Super Bowl. So Russell Wilson, I mean, let's keep the trend going. Let's ride, baby. And Russell Wilson is definitely a very wealthy man already. We know that. And he's even wealthier now. Let's just put it that way. So the $57 million, like you mentioned in 2022, Cody, that's going to be stacked upon over the next 8 months. According to Andrew Brandt, by March 2023, he has another $20 million bonus due, which means that over the next 8 months, Russell Wilson is going to have $77 million added to his bank account in total, which is crazy. And then in 2023, or in 2024, excuse me, he has a $22 million option as well as a $17 million salary, good for $39 million more dollars. So over the next 3 years, I know that we talked about this. It's essentially a 7-year deal worth $296 million in total money. We know that the 5 years and $245 million is what's added on top of what he already has. So essentially what this boils down to is that over the next 3 years, in cash, guaranteed cash, Russell Wilson is going to be getting $124 million in the next 3 years. And then the Broncos structured it so that they have 4 non-guaranteed years on top of these next 3 years. So even though the contract extension doesn't start until 2024, it's kind of a complicated deal, but obviously the Broncos have structured it in such a way to get Russell Wilson his cash quicker, and these cap hits are going to be pushed down the line here. So it's very fascinating, Cody. It's a really interesting deal for Russell Wilson. Obviously, $124 million over the next 3 years, $77 million in the next 8 months, $57 million basically today. I mean, it's a good deal for Russell Wilson, and it's good for quarterbacks in the NFL, no doubt.
Hey, Russ, we are your favorite Broncos podcast, my man, so, we appreciate you sponsoring the show if you ever do. Anyways, outside of that, we do have some breaking news, kind of breaking news. As we're recording this podcast, Sayre, kind of the Broncos addressing cornerback a little bit. The Broncos, according to Mike Kliss, our 9 News insider, has said Broncos have signed veteran cornerback Darius Phillips for their active 53-man roster, and with that move, the Broncos have waived cornerback Essang Bassey to make room. Part of me is now wondering, now with Bassey being waived, if he clears waivers, will they bring him back on the practice squad? But now you add in another experienced corner in Darius Phillips, who spent time with the Cincinnati Bengals and more recently with the Las Vegas Raiders. So that right there, I think, is a very, very interesting move here, Sayre. So, your quick thoughts on Darius Phillips?
I honestly don't hate this at all, Cody. I really liked Darius Phillips coming out of Western Michigan back in the day. He had 4 interceptions back in 2019, just as I'm pulling this up. 12 pass breakups back in 2020. Yeah, he's only 27, so he just turned 27 in June. It's a nice pickup for the Broncos, honestly. I don't mind this at all. You know my thoughts on Essang Bassey. Obviously, we all love Essang Bassey, and he's been a great pickup for the Broncos as an undrafted player, making the roster a number of times at this point. But I think Darius Phillips bringing that in-game experience at the outside cornerback position. He was also a really good return man at one point. I don't know if he still does that. The Broncos obviously don't need him to do that at this point. But in a pinch, obviously now you have another guy that can contribute in that way. So we knew the Broncos needed to add outside cornerback depth desperately. They get it now. Darius Phillips coming in. I like the pickup, Cody. I'm surprised he didn't make it in Las Vegas, as weak as their cornerback room is. We'll see if Ejiro Evero and Christian Parker and the defensive staff can put him in position to succeed.
Very interesting enough. 5 career interceptions for him, and if he can help the Broncos in any way, shape, or form get more takeaways, I think Denver's okay with that. I think they're on board with that as well. Well, Broncos country, that'll wrap up today's episode. Lockdown Broncos, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format. Not to mention, you can watch us on YouTube. Hit that subscribe, that follow button, so you never miss out on Denver Broncos news content coverage every single day, all year long. Courtesy Sayre, Bedinger, and myself. We have you covered. We'll have you covered all throughout next week as well. The NFL season will be here. We know that there's football next week with the Rams and the Bills, and then not this upcoming Monday, but the following Monday, the Broncos will be on the road at Seattle, week 1 of the NFL regular season. We have you covered every single day leading up to that matchup and more all year long here, the Locked On Broncos podcast.